In the quiet village of St. Mellow's, a death that seemed like despair hides a truth too gentle and too tragic to ignore. Tonight, Miss Marple listens to the whispers beneath the lilacs and uncovers what really happened. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. I am your host, Elias. Please like this video and subscribe this channel to be our permanent companion. Chapter 1. A Death in St. Mellow's. St. Mellow's was the sort of English village where mornings usually bloomed gently. The sun rose timidly over the lilac-lined lane. Bakeries cracked open their shutters with warm greetings. Chickens in dusty courtyards announced the day with noisy enthusiasm. But on this particular autumn morning, everything felt strangely muted, as though someone had placed a heavy blanket over the entire village. Doors opened half as wide. Voices dropped to cautious whispers. Even the river flowing behind the church seemed to hush itself. Mrs. Pembroke, Miss Marple's dear friend of many years, stood at her window, with trembling hands wrapped around her teacup. She watched. Neighbors gathered slowly at the church gate, their faces pale under the soft morning light. Miss Marple, staying as a guest in Mrs. Pembroke's rose-scented cottage, stepped lightly into the sitting room. "You're up early," she said, voice gentle but perceptive. Mrs. Pembroke turned, worry tightening her face. "Oh, Jane, something dreadful has happened. Truly dreadful." Miss Marple's brow creased just slightly. "And St. Mellow's? That would indeed be unusual." Mrs. Pembroke nodded. "They say Thomas Ravenscroft is dead." Miss Marple set down her teacup quietly. The words hung in the air like cold breath. Thomas Ravenscroft, bookkeeper, clerk, the vicar's right hand, was the very image of steady kindness. A man who kept parish accounts in perfect order and remembered everyone's birthday without ever drawing attention to himself. "And they say it was?" Mrs. Pembroke swallowed. "A suicide." Miss Marple's eyes softened with an emotion deeper than surprise. "I see," she murmured. "But you don't believe that?" Mrs. Pembroke shook her head quickly. "None of us do, Jane, none of us." And Miss Marple, who knew the quiet truth of human nature better than anyone, felt the first subtle ripple of a mystery forming. They arrived at the churchyard a little before 8. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and fallen leaves. Villagers gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones that seemed to sink into the earth rather than float upward. As soon as Miss Marple appeared, their whispers softened even further. Some people nodded politely. Others looked at her with quiet relief, as though her mere presence offered explanation, clarity, even safety. Constable Wilkins, earnest but slightly overwhelmed, stood stiffly at the gate, trying to look authoritative. "Miss Marple," he greeted, a mixture of respect and nervousness. "I'm afraid it's a bad business." Miss Marple looked past him toward the old stone belfry, tower looming silent under the gray sky. "Thomas Ravenscroft?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Found him at first light, rope and all. There was a note." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "A note?" "Yes, miss." "In his pocket," said I'm sorry, very tidy, very straightforward. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in judgment, but in thought. "Straightforward?" she repeated lightly. Constable Wilkins flushed, misreading her tone. "I mean, well, seems clear from the situation." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "My dear Wilkins," she said kindly, "situations are rarely clear. People even less so." The constable swallowed and glanced away. At that moment the vicar emerged from the church, his face ashen, shoulders bent under the weight of shock and sorrow. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I cannot fathom it. Thomas, he was like a son to me." Miss Marple nodded gently. "May I see where he was found?" The vicar hesitated, then nodded. "If anyone should look—" "It is you." The belfry loomed tall, its stone steps slick with the morning frost. The air near it felt colder, heavier, as though it held the final breath of something unspoken. Miss Marple stepped carefully onto the first stone, her gloved hand brushing the rail. Frost shimmered in delicate patterns, except for a few odd patches where it had been disturbed, scuffed, smudged, or melted away. Constable Wilkins pointed nervously to a coiled rope lying near the steps. "That's it, the rope he used." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Used?" She inspected it quietly. The frost on the stones was untouched, but the rope had none, not even a trace. "Curious," she murmured. "What is?" the constable asked. "Oh, simply that ropes left outside in autumn nights tend to gather frost," she said gently. "This one did not." Constable Wilkins blinked. "Oh, well, perhaps it was moved." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "perhaps." She bent farther, noticing something faint on the lower step. A small drag mark, thin but unmistakable. Someone had moved a heavy object down the steps, or a body. She quietly tucked that observation into her thoughts, like a stitch in fine lacework. Inside the small vestry, the constable handed Miss Marple the note found on Thomas's body. "I'm sorry," it read. Neatly written. Calm, almost graceful, Miss Marple held it delicately. "Constable," she said, "do you ever write something in deep distress?" He blinked. Not that I recall, miss." "Will," she replied with a faint smile. Human hands tremble. Letters waver, ink blots. Pressure on the paper increases from agitation. She tapped the edge of the note. "This has none of those qualities." She studied the lettering again. "Thomas Ravenscroft's natural handwriting has a slight rightward lean, does it not?" The constable frowned. "I suppose so. He writes the parish notices, those tilt right a bit, yes." Miss Marple handed him the suicide note, gently. "Then observe, dear boy. This one tilts left." Constable Wilkins stared. "Oh." Miss Marple nodded. The hand that wrote this was not Thomas's. The room grew silent. Even the vicar inhaled sharply. Miss Marple stood at the vestry window, looking out toward the village green, where people gathered anxiously, seeking comfort in each other's presence. "Thomas Ravenscroft was not a man given to despair," she said softly. "He was precise, dependable, gentle. Men like him do not write tidy notes before dying." The vicar swallowed hard. "Then what do you believe, Miss Marple?" She turned, her expression grave. "That the truth is hiding behind small things, behind a rope without frost, a note without distress, footprints that do not match a climb, and villagers who whisper not of sorrow, but uncertainty." The vicar closed his eyes. "You believe it was not suicide?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "My dear Reverend, I believe Thomas did not choose his end." Outside, the church bells remained silent, too heavy to ring. Miss Marple stepped into the cold morning air and breathed deeply. A murder had been quietly committed in St. Mellow's, and from this moment on she would follow every hidden thread, every whisper, every clue, every truth softened by time. She walked toward the Ravenscroft cottage. The investigation had begun. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Suicide. Miss Marple walked slowly around the belfry, her steps soft, deliberate, careful not to disturb the frost-dusted ground. The sun had risen higher now, lighting the stones with a pale silver glow. But something about the belfry still felt colder than the rest of the village, as if the air had absorbed the shock of the morning's discovery. She paused at the lowest step. There, a crescent-shaped patch of frost still clung to the stone, untouched and perfect. Yet directly beside it the frost was smeared, disturbed in an uneven pattern. Miss Marple crouched slightly, leaning closer. "Dragged," she whispered. "Not walked, not stepped on. Dragged." Mrs. Pembroke hovered nearby, clutching her shawl. "What is it, Jane?" she asked anxiously. Miss Marple stood slowly. "My dear, if Thomas Ravenscroft had climbed these steps himself, the frost would show a neat succession of footprints." She pointed gently. "But here the frost has been pushed sideways, as if something heavy, too heavy for one's own legs, had been pulled down." Mrs. Pembroke let out a soft gasp. "You mean someone moved him?" Miss Marple gave a small, grave nod. "Yes, and not with any gentleness." The vicar approached, his face full of sorrow. "Miss Marple, is it possible that he slipped, fell?" Miss Marple looked quietly at the marks again. "No," she said softly. "A slip leaves chaos. This is careful, intentional." A bird cawed sharply overhead. The sound cut through the stillness like a warning. Miss Marple straightened, her face thoughtful. "Whoever staged this scene," she murmured, "was in a hurry, but not hurried enough to erase everything." Constable Wilkins approached again, holding the rope awkwardly in his hands. "We found it lying across him, miss." As if he used it. Miss Marple reached for it. The rope was dry, completely dry, and the stones above were still wet with frost. She ran a gloved finger along its fibers. "No moisture," she said. "No frost, not even a hint of chill." The constable blinked. "I suppose someone could have shaken it off?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Wilkins, rope absorbs dampness like gossip absorbs the village. If this rope had hung outdoors overnight, it would carry the cold of the stones and frost between the twists of its fibers." She held the rope lightly with 2 fingers. "And yet it is warm, too warm." Constable Wilkins scratched his head. It was lying near his shoulder. Miss Marple's eyes softened in a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Placed there, not used." She laid the rope back on the stone. "And the knot found? Was it tied firmly?" Wilkins hesitated. "Well, no. More like arranged." Miss Marple's gaze became quieter still. "Arranged," she repeated gently. "A dreadful word when applied to death." Mrs. Pembroke shivered. "Do you think it was murder, then?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and surveyed the entire belfry. "The truth," she said softly, "often whispers first, and today I hear no whisper of suicide." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the ground just beyond the steps. A small shape white, delicate lay half hidden among fallen leaves. She knelt and picked it up carefully. "A lilac petal," she murmured. The vicar frowned. "But lilacs don't bloom now, not in October." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied softly. She examined the petal's edge. It was fresh, not wilted, not blown here by weather. "Cut recently." She held it up. "Someone who handled lilacs touched the scene," she said quietly. "And Thomas Ravenscroft never wore or carried flowers." Mrs. Pembroke nodded, pale. "He wasn't the sort for boutonnieres or garden picking." Miss Marple thought for a long moment. "There is only one place in St. Mellow's with white lilacs still kept in bloom this season," she finally said. "The Ravenscroft cottage. Mrs. Ravenscroft grows them indoors." Mrs. Pembroke gasped. "Are you suggesting?" Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "I am suggesting nothing yet, my dear. But clues do not lie." She tucked the petal into her pocket. "White lilac in autumn tells a story, a quiet but important one." Miss Marple walked around the far side of the belfry. Footprints marked the damp earth, some heavy, some lighter. Constable Wilkins followed her nervously. "These prints here," Miss Marple said, pointing to deeper ones near the base of the steps. "A man stood here for a long time. Longer than Thomas would have if he had been preparing, you know." The constable nodded slowly. "I see. They look thoughtful prints, paused prints." "Indeed. And look at the shape." Miss Marple knelt beside them. "The heels are deep, the arches shallow." Someone leaned back on their heels, thinking, waiting, perhaps nervous. "And these prints?" Wilkins asked, pointing to a smaller pair. Miss Marple nodded. "A woman's, going toward the church, not away from it." He swallowed. "Mrs. Ravenscroft?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, she continued tracing the pattern. "And these here," she murmured, "drag marks, soft, uneven, leading from the side of the belfry, not from the steps." Thomas had not walked to the steps. He had been brought. She rose. "In the quietest villages," Miss Marple said softly, "the truth is always written under our feet. We simply must learn to read it." They returned to the churchyard. Miss Marple stood beneath a tall yew tree, her hands folded, her eyes calm, but intensely focused. Mrs. Pembroke approached her. "Jane, what happens now?" Miss Marple looked toward the distant Ravenscroft cottage, its chimney smoke rising faintly, its white lilacs blooming unnaturally through glass windows. "I must pay my respects," she said, and gently, quietly, observe the widow's grief. The vicar joined them, his voice trembling. "Miss Marple, I fear that what we find may break this village." She placed a gentle hand over his. "My dear Reverend, villages are like people. Sometimes a wound must be uncovered before it can heal." She stepped toward the gate. "I will speak to Mrs. Ravenscroft now." Her voice softened. Truth deserves to be found even when it has been hidden with care. She walked down the lane of lilac trees, her pace steady, her posture graceful. Behind her the villagers watched with hopeful, anxious eyes. They did not know the truth of Thomas Ravenscroft's death, but Miss Marple did, and she would unravel it thread by thread, petal by petal, step by step. The investigation had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The lane leading toward the Ravenscroft cottage was quiet, too quiet for mid-morning in St. Mellow's. The lilac trees lining the road, bare of blooms this late in the year, creaked gently in the soft wind. Their branches cast delicate shadows across the path like long, reaching fingers. Miss Marple walked at her usual unhurried pace, her eyes drifting over every detail. A closed curtain here, a hastily swept doorstep there, the faint soot smell from a fireplace, burning too early in the day, each small element threaded into her mind like pieces of a quiet tapestry. Villagers passed her in ones and twos, pausing long enough to offer hushed condolences or worried glances. "Poor Thomas," Mrs. Aldridge whispered as she passed. "Such a good man, such a terrible fate." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Terrible indeed." "He didn't seem the sort," Mr. Dinright muttered. "Not the kind of man to well do such a thing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Few who know human nature would disagree. By the time she reached the Ravenscroft gate, she had heard enough fragments of village chatter to form the outline of something important. Thomas Ravenscroft had no enemies, but he had secrets. And St. Mellow's, for all its gentleness, was a place where secrets lived uneasily. The Ravenscroft cottage stood modestly beneath a chimney that sent a thin line of smoke into the gray sky. A row of white lilacs, unnaturally blooming and slightly wilted, hung in vases along the front window-sill. Miss Marple took note of them. Indoor lilacs in late autumn required careful handling, and careful handling always left traces. She knocked gently. A moment passed. Then footsteps, slow and hesitant, approached the door. Mrs. Ravenscroft appeared pale, hollow-eyed, clutching her shawl, as if it held her together. "Miss Marple," she whispered. Mrs. Pembroke said you might visit." Miss Marple smiled softly kind, gentle, unthreatening. "I came only to offer my condolences," she said. Mrs. Ravenscroft stepped back to let her in. The cottage felt warm, almost uncomfortably so, as if the fireplace had been tended too eagerly. A vase of fresh-cut white lilacs sat prominently on the mantel, their scent clinging to the air. Miss Marple's eyes moved briefly to the widow's hands, a thin scratch along her left palm, and beneath her nails a faint trace of soil, the same pale soil found near the belfry. They sat in the drawing-room, where the ticking of a mantel clock filled the silence between them. Mrs. Ravenscroft poured tea with trembling fingers. Miss Marple accepted the cup graciously. "I know this is difficult," she said gently, "but if speaking helps even a little, I am here to listen." Mrs. Ravenscroft took a shaky breath. "Thomas, he wasn't himself these last days. He paced. He said he was troubled." "I thought he meant the accounts." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "The church accounts?" "Yes," Mrs. Ravenscroft said quickly, almost too quickly. He said he had found a mistake, something that needed to be corrected." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did he say what the mistake was?" Mrs. Ravenscroft lowered her gaze. "No, only that it weighed on him." Miss Marple looked toward the lilacs on the mantel. "Such beautiful flowers," she remarked softly. "And so rare at this time." Mrs. Ravenscroft swallowed hard. "Oh, yes. Thomas liked them. I cut them last evening. I thought they would comfort him." Miss Marple's voice remained calm, delicate. "And did they?" Mrs. Ravenscroft's eyes filled with tears. She struggled to blink away. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anything anymore." She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Miss Marple waited patiently, allowing the grief, or something that looked like grief, to wash over her. But even through her sobs, Mrs. Ravenscroft's hands remained tightly clenched, as if hiding more than sorrow. After a time, Miss Marple stood politely. "Perhaps some air would help," she suggested. "May I walk through your garden? It looks lovely from the window." Mrs. Ravenscroft hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes, of course. The garden is at the back." Miss Marple stepped outside onto a narrow path, lined with fallen leaves and soft patches of earth. Immediately, she saw them. Footprints, a single set, smaller than a man's, leading from the back door toward the line of lilac shrubs, then looping around the side of the house. Miss Marple knelt slightly, her fingers brushing the edges. Recent, formed before dawn. Her eyes lifted toward the lilacs themselves. Several stems had been cut hastily, irregular angles, petals bruised, leaves torn. Not the careful hand of someone making an arrangement. The hand of someone in distress or panic. A tiny petal lay near the step, just like the one at the belfry. Miss Marple picked it up gently and placed it beside the first. 2 clues, 1 story. She stood, letting the faint wind carry the scent of lilacs past her. Then something near the garden shed caught her attention, a half-cleaned pair of boots, resting just inside the open door. Mud still clung to the soles. Pale mud, the same color as the soil near the church. Miss Marple's breath softened. "Mrs. Ravenscroft was here early," she murmured. "Earlier than she admits." When Miss Marple returned inside, Mrs. Ravenscroft sat rigidly in her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You have a lovely home," Miss Marple said kindly, sitting opposite her. Mrs. Ravenscroft nodded stiffly. "Thomas built much of it with his own hands. And he seemed a man who valued honesty," Miss Marple continued gently, "in his work, his accounts, his dealings." Mrs. Ravenscroft flinched almost imperceptibly. "Yes, he did." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Last night, do you recall what time he went out?" Mrs. Ravenscroft's eyes widened just a fraction. "Out? He didn't go out. He stayed home." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I see." But inside her mind, several threads tightened neatly. Thomas Ravenscroft discovered a mistake in the church accounts. He had argued with someone, likely his wife. She had cut lilacs in haste. She had gone out before dawn. There were drag marks at the belfry. The suicide note did not match Thomas's hand. The rope was staged. Miss Marple rose with gentle grace. "Thank you, Mrs. Ravenscroft. You must rest. I will call again." Mrs. Ravenscroft swallowed hard, her voice thin. "Yes, thank you." Miss Marple stepped outside into the cold, crisp air. The truth was beginning to take shape, not fully, not clearly, but enough for her to know. Thomas Ravenscroft had tried to do the right thing. Someone else had tried to do the opposite. She looked once more toward the belfry tower in the distance. Then she began her walk back toward the village. There were more whispers to hear, more clues to gather, and more truth to gently coax into the light. Chapter 4. Behind Closed Doors. St. Mellow's rarely held secrets for long, its cottages close enough that whispers drifted freely through open windows, and its people knit together by generations of shared lives. But now the village seemed bound by something heavy and unspoken. By midday the sky had deepened into a slate gray, and a fine mist hung above the rooftops like a second layer of cloud. Miss Marple walked along the narrow lanes, noticing subtle shifts in village behavior. Mrs. Aldridge cleaning her steps twice in 1 hour, as though scrubbing away worry. The butcher speaking too softly, his usual cheer dimmed. Children playing with subdued curiosity, keeping close to home. Rumors had transformed overnight into an uneasy chorus. Thomas wasn't troubled. He looked perfectly well last evening. Why so sudden? Truth, Miss Marple knew, was like smoke. It found its way out, no matter how tightly one tried to contain it. Today she returned to the Ravenscroft cottage, not for accusations, but for understanding. Mrs. Ravenscroft was a woman carrying sorrow, but whether sorrow for a husband lost or for a truth buried, Miss Marple was still determining. Mrs. Ravenscroft opened the door at once, as though she had been waiting. Her eyes were red, her movements hurried but tense. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you so soon." Miss Marple offered a kind smile. "I thought it best to see how you were faring, my dear. Grief can feel heavier when one is alone." Mrs. Ravenscroft stepped aside, gesturing her in. The interior of the cottage was warm, almost overly so. The fire crackled brightly, though it wasn't cold enough outside to warrant such heat. On a side table, the vase of white lilacs had begun to wilt. A few petals lay scattered beside it, fresh enough that they hadn't browned. Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Mrs. Ravenscroft's left hand. The scratch she'd noticed earlier looked deeper today. Her palm was red, irritated, almost like someone had gripped a rough surface too tightly. "Would you like some tea?" the widow asked. "If it's not too much trouble." Mrs. Ravenscroft moved toward the kitchen. Miss Marple followed her with a slow, thoughtful gaze. There was something in the woman's movements, sharp, controlled, as though she feared that slowing down would allow truth to surface. While Mrs. Ravenscroft prepared the tea, Miss Marple quietly examined the sitting room again. A faint scuff on the floor near the door, the edge of a rug slightly misaligned, a small streak of pale mud on the wooden threshold. Clues rarely shouted. They whispered. When they sat, tea steaming between them, Miss Marple spoke in her gentle, grandmotherly way. My dear, I know grief can distort memory, but it's important we speak clearly about Thomas's final evening. Mrs. Ravenscroft's fingers tightened around her cup. I've told everything to the constable. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Yes, but sometimes people tell the constable what they believe they ought to say, and they tell an old woman like me what they truly feel. Mrs. Ravenscroft's breath shuddered. I don't know what I feel anymore. Then perhaps begin with what you remember, Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Ravenscroft closed her eyes. We spoke about the church accounts. He said there was an error. Something needed correcting. He was upset. Upset? Miss Marple asked softly. Or determined? The widow hesitated. Determined, I suppose. He always took his duties seriously. And did he leave the house at any point? Mrs. Ravenscroft's eyes widened a fraction too much. No, I told you he stayed in. Miss Marple nodded slowly, not pressing further, what she noticed. When Mrs. Ravenscroft sipped her tea, her hands trembled. When she lowered the cup, she winced, as though her palm hurt. Miss Marple leaned forward very slightly, voice soft as a whisper. My dear, your hand, it seems injured. Mrs. Ravenscroft instinctively hid it under her sleeve. Oh, it's nothing. A scratch from the garden. Miss Marple tilted her head. From the garden yesterday? Yes, yesterday evening. Miss Marple kept her face serene. I see. And you were in the garden before or after Thomas spoke of the accounts? Mrs. Ravenscroft blinked rapidly. I don't remember. Her voice wavered. Her breath quickened. Her shoulders curled inward. Miss Marple placed her cup down gently. You're carrying a burden far heavier than grief, my dear. Mrs. Ravenscroft looked up suddenly, fear flashing across her face. I haven't done anything wrong, she whispered. Miss Marple didn't answer. She simply waited. And in the silence the widow couldn't meet her eyes. As Miss Marple stood to leave, she allowed her eyes to drift once more to the vase of white lilacs. How beautiful they are, she remarked softly. Mrs. Ravenscroft forced a thin smile. Yes. Thomas liked them. You cut them in the evening? Yes. Miss Marple leaned closer to the petals. Curious, she murmured almost to herself. What is curious? Mrs. Ravenscroft asked quickly. Miss Marple straightened. Only that the edges of these cuts, she gently touched a stem, are jagged. They were made in haste, by a trembling hand, not by a woman arranging flowers in calm. Mrs. Ravenscroft stiffened. And you see this? Miss Marple lifted a fallen petal from the carpet. Fresh, soft, unwilted, cut only hours before dawn. The widow's breath caught. I don't understand. Miss Marple looked at her gently. White lilac petals do not travel on their own, my dear, yet one was found near the belfry. And now here is another, matching it perfectly. Mrs. Ravenscroft's face drained of color. I didn't go there, she whispered. I didn't. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. Grief can confuse the mind, but truth never confuses the conscience. Mrs. Ravenscroft began to tremble. I'm not a bad person, she said in a strangled whisper. I never meant for anything terrible to happen. I only wanted... But she stopped herself abruptly, pressing a hand over her mouth. Miss Marple's voice remained steady and soft. You only wanted... What, my dear? Mrs. Ravenscroft shook her head, tears building. I can't. Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. You need not tell me now, but you must tell someone. Secrets kept too long become very heavy. As Miss Marple left the cottage, the mist had thickened, wrapping the village in a soft blur. She walked slowly, deep in thought. The crisp air tasted of damp earth and unsaid truths. White lilac petals, a rope with no frost, Footprints around the garden, drag marks at the belfry, a forged note, a trembling widow. Pieces of the puzzle were aligning not yet into the full picture, but unmistakably toward it. Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked back. Mrs. Ravenscroft watched from the window, gripping her shawl, her face ghostly pale. "She is a woman trapped," Miss Marple murmured. "Not evil, but afraid, terribly afraid." She continued walking toward the village square, where the constable and vicar waited anxiously for guidance. Miss Marple's cane tapped softly against the stones. "Thomas Ravenscroft tried to set something right," she whispered to herself, "and someone else tried desperately to prevent it." Her eyes lifted toward the belfry tower in the distance, standing dark and silent against the gray sky. "It was not a suicide," she said softly, "and soon. St. Mellow's will know why." Chapter 5 cracks in the story. The church office smelled faintly of old paper, beeswax polish, and the lingering scent of incense from last Sunday's service. The morning light streamed through the stained glass window in soft hues of amber and rose, casting gentle patterns over the vicar's desk. Miss Marple stood before a neatly arranged stack of ledgers, Thomas Ravenscroft's final work. The vicar, still pale from shock, gestured toward them. "He was up late last night," he said quietly, "sorting the collection funds. He had always been meticulous." Miss Marple nodded and adjusted her spectacles. "He told his wife he found an error," she recalled. "Yes, so she said," the vicar murmured, sighing. "But Thomas rarely made mistakes." Miss Marple ran her fingers along the columns of numbers, tidy, precise, written in Thomas's unmistakable slanted script. At first glance, everything looked balanced. But she noticed something odd. 2 entries had been rewritten, same amount, different envelopes, shifted, not missing. "Reconciliation without discrepancy," she murmured. The vicar leaned closer. "What does that mean?" Miss Marple tapped gently on the ledger. "He corrected something moved funds back where they belonged. Someone had tampered before him." The vicar gasped softly. "You mean someone else was at fault?" Miss Marple closed the ledger. "Yes, and Thomas discovered who." As she spoke, a soft memory flickered across her mind. Mrs. Ravenscroft's trembling hands, the hurriedly cut lilacs, the scratch on her palm. But Miss Marple never allowed conclusions to outrun evidence. She stepped away from the desk. "Reverend," she said softly, "when someone tries to hide wrongdoing, they often panic when confronted. And panic leads to tragic mistakes." The vicar swallowed hard. "You believe he confronted someone?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted with calm certainty. "Yes, and I believe that person tried desperately to silence him." Miss Marple walked back to the belfry, her cane tapping softly along the worn stone path. The frost had melted in most places now, revealing damp earth that retained impressions with surprising clarity. Constable Wilkins hurried over the moment he saw her. "Miss Marple, I was going to fetch you. Something's odd." "Oh?" she asked mildly. He pointed to the ground near the grass. "These prints here small feet, likely a woman, and over there larger ones. But they don't match Thomas's boots." Miss Marple crouched gracefully. The larger prints were deeper at the heel. "Someone stood here for a long time," she noted. "And these?" Wilkins pointed to the smaller set. "Going toward the steps," Miss Marple said, "not away from them." Wilkins frowned. "So she walked toward the belfry after it happened?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, Constable. She walked there before." He stared, bewildered. "How can you tell?" Miss Marple traced a faint drag line with her finger. "The smaller prints are sharp-edged, firm, made while the frost was still forming. The drag marks," she ran a finger along the blurred path, "are fresher, They occurred after the frost settled. Wilkins's face went pale. "You mean?" Miss Marple nodded softly. "She was there first, he was brought later." She stood. "And Thomas Ravenscroft never climbed these steps." The constable swallowed. "Then who did?" Miss Marple's tone remained calm, but her eyes held gravity. "Someone who loved him or feared him." Miss Marple returned to the vestry and requested a few samples of Thomas Ravenscroft's handwriting. Sermons he had copied, parish lists, donation records. She laid them out carefully on the table, then placed the suicide note beside them. Mrs. Pembroke, who had joined her, watched with wide, worried eyes. "Jane, surely you don't think the note was forged?" Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied the notes with the intensity of a seamstress comparing stitches. At last she spoke. "The differences are subtle," she said, "but unmistakable." Mrs. Pembroke leaned closer. "How so?" Miss Marple pointed gently. "Thomas's handwriting slants right. The note slants left." She touched a line on the parish list. "These strokes are smooth." His hand was steady. But the note noticed a slight tremble, someone trying too hard to disguise their natural hand. "And this," she continued, "Thomas always made his Y tails long. On the note, short. Forced." Mrs. Pembroke gasped softly. "Oh, Jane, whoever wrote this wasn't Thomas at all." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "and that changes everything." The constable entered, breathless. "Miss Marple, people are saying that you think he was murdered." Miss Marple folded the papers neatly. "I do not say it lightly, constable," she replied. "But Thomas Ravenscroft did not choose to end his life. Someone chose for him." The room fell into a tense silence. Miss Marple visited the Ravenscroft garden once more, but this time she wasn't alone. She had asked the village gardener, Mr. Elwood, to meet her there. He arrived with his cap in hand, his boots covered in the morning soil. "You wish to speak with me, miss?" he asked politely. "Yes, Mr. Elwood," Miss Marple said warmly. "You tend to several gardens in the village, do you not?" "Certainly, miss, including this one." "Then tell me," she said, pointing to the lilacs, "were they cut last evening?" Mr. Elwood scratched his chin. "No, miss. I trimmed them 2 days ago. Mrs. Ravenscroft doesn't usually cut them herself." Miss Marple nodded. "And do you recall seeing anyone in this garden very early this morning?" Mr. Elwood frowned, thinking. Now that you mention it. I saw a figure moving quickly. Could have been Mrs. Ravenscroft, hard to tell with the fog. What time?" "Just before dawn." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That will do, thank you." Mr. Elwood nodded and departed. Miss Marple lingered in the garden, her gaze drifting over the earth. Many footsteps, fresh soil, a woman's hurried cuts. Panic had lived here, and panic always left traces. Miss Marple walked toward the village square as the afternoon shadows lengthened. People paused in their tasks to watch her, sensing she carried a quiet, emerging truth. Constable Wilkins joined her at the crossing. "Miss Marple, please tell me, do you know who did it?" Miss Marple gave him a gentle, almost sorrowful look. "I know who was here," she said softly. "I know who lied. And I know who Thomas spoke with last." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. "But knowing is not the same as proving." Wilkins nodded nervously. "Then what will you do?" Miss Marple's eyes lifted toward the belfry, tower tall, silent, holding the echo of a crime disguised as tragedy. "I will gather everyone who knows pieces of the truth," she said calmly. "And when the moment is right, the rest will reveal itself." She walked on, thoughtful and steady. Behind her, St. Mellow's carried a heavy breath of anticipation. Miss Marple already saw the shape of the truth faint, but undeniable. A confrontation had occurred. A struggle had taken place. A life had ended not by despair, but by fear. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew. The truth was ready to be found. The village was not. Chapter 6. Motive in the Lilacs. By the following morning, St. Mellow's felt as though it were breathing differently, unevenly, anxiously. Whispers had grown into tight murmurs, traveling from doorway to doorway, with the unease of a storm's shadow. Miss Marple, walking along the lane with a thoughtful hand on her cane, could feel the shift. Even the air seemed to tremble with unfinished truth. Mrs. Aldridge pretended to tidy her porch, but kept glancing toward the Ravenscroft cottage. Mr. Dinright mended a gate, but hammered too hard, releasing nervous tension with each strike. Children watched adults more than they played. Everyone feared what Miss Marple already knew. Thomas Ravenscroft's death had not been a simple tragedy. Something darker lay beneath it. But Miss Marple was not a woman who rushed truth. She allowed it to blossom quietly, root by root. Today's visit would take her to someone who never missed a detail, the gardener, Mr. Elwood. And more importantly, to the lilacs that whispered their own story. Mr. Elwood met her at the churchyard gate, tugging at his cap respectfully. "Miss Marple," he greeted. "You asked to see me about the lilacs again?" "Yes, indeed," she said kindly. "I fear those flowers have more to say than anyone expects." Mr. Elwood smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Miss Marple motioned for him to walk with her. Together they moved toward the far end of the churchyard, where the lilac shrubs grew deep, green leaves trembling softly in the breeze, though not a single bloom remained this late in the year. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "did you ever notice Mrs. Ravenscroft cut her own flowers before?" He frowned, thinking. "No, miss. She's never been one for pruning. Always said she hadn't the hand for it. Thomas did most of the indoor arranging." Miss Marple nodded. "And yesterday morning? You mentioned seeing someone in their garden?" "Aye, a shadowy figure. Couldn't say for sure, but looked like her." Miss Marple stopped walking. "And she moved quickly, you said?" "Yes, miss, like she were in a hurry or frightened." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Thank you, Mr. Elwood. You've been most helpful." As he tipped his cap and left, Miss Marple looked out across the fields. Fear. A rushed hand. Lilac petals scattered where they didn't belong. The lilac clue was no longer simply a loose thread. It was a thread pulling everything taut. When Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, she found the vicar pacing the study floor, head bowed. "Oh, Miss Marple," he breathed, "the village is in uproar. They're beginning to suspect things I dare not imagine." Miss Marple gave a sympathetic smile. "Truth unsettles people before it frees them," she said softly. "Tell me, Reverend, these church accounts Thomas corrected, who had access to them?" The vicar sat heavily in a chair. "Well, Thomas, of course, myself, and Mrs. Ravenscroft occasionally, when she helped prepare donation envelopes." Miss Marple kept her expression serene, though the answer confirmed her suspicions. "I see. And did you notice anything unusual in recent weeks?" The vicar sighed deeply. "He said he found something improper, a misplacement of funds. I assumed it was a small error." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Did he say whether he confronted someone?" The vicar's gaze dropped to the floor. "He didn't say, but he looked troubled, more troubled than I've ever seen him." Miss Marple stood and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Fear, Reverend, can make ordinary people do extraordinary things, and guilt can make them do terrible ones." The vicar swallowed hard. "You believe Mrs. Ravenscroft?" Miss Marple raised her hand. "I believe she is frightened. And frightened people often hide more than wrongdoing, they hide shame. Miss Marple returned once more to the Ravenscroft cottage. Mrs. Ravenscroft opened the door, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with sleepless shadows. I didn't expect visitors," she stammered. Miss Marple gave her a warm, reassuring look. "My dear, you've gone through great distress. I wished only to see how you fare." Mrs. Ravenscroft trembled as she stepped aside. The cottage interior had grown more disordered, the rug askew, a cup unwashed in the sink, a shawl dropped carelessly on the floor. Signs of a person losing composure. Miss Marple sat gently. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," she began softly, "I must ask you a difficult question. Were you in the garden before dawn on the morning Thomas was found?" The widow inhaled sharply. I don't understand why you'd ask such a thing." Miss Marple continued, her tone warm but firm. "Lilac petals were found near the belfry, and your boots by the garden shed had pale soil on them, the same soil as the churchyard." Mrs. Ravenscroft's face crumpled. I didn't mean for anything to happen." Miss Marple's heart soft with compassion. "My dear, you may speak freely. I am not here to judge, only to help truth find its way." Mrs. Ravenscroft covered her face with trembling hands. "He found out," she whispered. "Thomas found out about the money. It was only a little only what I needed for Mother's medicine. He said he couldn't ignore it, said he had to tell the vicar." "And you argued," Miss Marple said gently, completing the thought. The widow nodded violently. "He was angry. I've never seen him like that. He grabbed my arm and I pulled away. I pushed him back. I didn't think." Her voice broke. One moment he was standing. The next he fell, hit his head on the stone table. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Not in shock, but in sorrow. And in fear," Mrs. Ravenscroft continued. "I dragged him to the belfry. I thought if it looked like a suicide, no one would hate me." Tears streamed down her face. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "I only meant to stop the argument." Miss Marple reached across and held her hand. "Fear and guilt cloud reason," she said softly. "But truth always brings clarity." When Miss Marple stepped out of the cottage, the sky had brightened. The mist was finally lifting, revealing rooftops and fields with gentle clarity, much like the truth that now lay bare. Thomas Ravenscroft had died defending honesty. Mrs. Ravenscroft had acted out of panic, then fear, then remorse. Miss Marple walked toward the village square, where the constable and vicar waited. "It is time," she said softly. "There's something you both must hear." The constable's face tightened. "Miss Marple, do you know who did it?" "Yes," she said quietly. "But more importantly, I know why." She looked toward the distant belfry. "It was not a suicide. It was an accident born of fear, and hidden by someone who loved him too much to face her own mistake." The vicar closed his eyes in grief. Miss Marple took a slow breath. "The truth is painful," she murmured, "but pain faced honestly heals faster than lies carried forever." And with that she walked toward the church ready to gather the pieces of truth and reveal them gently, compassionately, to a village that needed answers. The heart of the mystery was now clear, but the hardest part, bringing truth to light, was yet to come. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. St. Mellow's felt eerily still that afternoon. Clouds hung low and gray over the rooftops, and the hush that had seeped into the village since Thomas's death now settled like a heavy shawl over every doorstep. Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane, her steps steady, her thoughts quiet but sharp. Every whisper she passed through added to the tapestry of truth forming in her mind. He wasn't the type to take his own life. Mrs. Ravenscroft hasn't slept, And Thomas, such a decent man. The village was holding its breath. Inside the Ravenscroft cottage, the widow sat in a chair with trembling hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple could see her through the window still, pale, staring into nothingness. The sight tugged at something tender in her heart. Fear had a way of wringing the soul dry. Miss Marple knocked gently. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," she said when the door opened. "May I trouble you for a few minutes? Only a few." The widow swallowed hard. "Yes, yes, please come in." Inside, the cottage felt smaller than before, its warmth suffocating rather than comforting. The fire burned too brightly, as though someone wished to destroy coldness or truth. Miss Marple sat opposite her, careful and quiet. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," she said kindly, "sometimes the weight of a secret becomes heavier than the truth itself." The widow's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I don't know what you mean." But her voice was barely more than a breath. Miss Marple placed her gloved hands gently over her own cane. "I think you do." The words settled between them like the first crack in an icy pond. Miss Marple kept her tone soft, non-threatening, like a grandmother speaking to a frightened child. "You hurt your hand," she observed gently. "That must have been painful." Mrs. Ravenscroft instinctively hid her left hand beneath her shawl. "It's nothing, just a gardening accident." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the fresh lilacs in the vase. "Ah, yes, the lilacs," she said quietly. "Though you don't usually cut them. Mr. Elwood said Thomas handled those." The widow stiffened. "And yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "the cuts on the stems are jagged, done in haste. Not like Thomas's careful trimming." Mrs. Ravenscroft's throat bobbed with a shaky swallow. "I was upset," she whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Upset enough that your hand shook, and nicked itself on the pruning shears." Mrs. Ravenscroft looked away, her breathing shallow. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "My dear, when a person is distressed, the truth often finds its way into their body before it reaches their tongue. Your hand, the soil beneath your nails, the boots by the shed, they speak for you." The widow's breath caught. "I didn't mean," she began, then stopped herself as if she had slipped too far. Miss Marple waited patient, gentle, still. Mrs. Ravenscroft's resolve wavered visibly. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes glistened. "That night," she whispered, "I didn't know what to do. Everything happened so fast." Miss Marple gave a small nod of encouragement. "You need not fear judgment from me," she said softly. "Only tell me what weighs on your heart." Mrs. Ravenscroft's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl. "He found out," she began, voice cracking, "about the money." Miss Marple stayed completely still. Mrs. Ravenscroft continued, tears streaming freely now. "It wasn't much, only what I needed for my mother's medicines. I kept meaning to replace it. I swear I did. But Thomas saw the accounts. He confronted me." The widow pressed her hand to her forehead. "He was so angry, not shouting, but disappointed, deeply disappointed. That was worse." "Disappointment is sometimes sharper than anger," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Ravenscroft nodded tearfully. "He said he had to tell the vicar, that honesty demanded it. I panicked. I tried to stop him from leaving the cottage." She took a shuddering breath. "It was only a push, just a desperate push. I didn't mean to." Her voice broke into sobs. Miss Marple placed a steady hand on her arm. "Oh, my dear." Mrs. Ravenscroft buried her face in her hands. He stumbled backward and hit his head on the stone table in the garden. "I ran to him. I shouted his name, but he didn't move. He just didn't move." The room felt unbearably still. Miss Marple's heart ached with the quiet tragedy of it. She let the widow cry because grief mixed with guilt needed space to breathe. At last Mrs. Ravenscroft whispered, "I didn't know what to do. I thought if they believed he killed himself, no one would know, no one would blame me." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "And so," she said softly, "you carried him to the church?" Mrs. Ravenscroft nodded, trembling violently. "Yes, I dragged him. I thought the belfry stairs would make it look plausible." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "But I couldn't lift him far. I left marks. I didn't think anyone would notice." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "One always notices, my dear, if one knows how to look." Mrs. Ravenscroft wiped her face with shaking hands. "I loved him," she said in a broken whisper. "He was a good man, too good, and I was so afraid of losing everything. Losing him, losing our home, losing the little respect I had." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "My dear, fear makes fools of us all, and shame makes prisoners." Mrs. Ravenscroft sobbed harder. "I forged the note," she confessed. "I tried to copy his handwriting. I didn't want to, but I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't thinking clearly." Miss Marple nodded, understanding. "Of course you weren't. Panic is a cruel master." The widow clung to the armchair as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "I didn't want to deceive anyone," she whispered. "I just wanted to survive the night." Miss Marple's voice grew soft. "And yet, in trying to survive, you sank deeper into despair." Mrs. Ravenscroft nodded miserably. "I can't sleep. I can't eat. I see Thomas every time I close my eyes." Miss Marple reached over and gently held her hand. "My dear, confession is not the end of suffering, but it is the beginning of healing." The widow stared at her, eyes swollen, heart breaking open. "What will happen to me?" she whispered. Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. "Truth must be faced, but you will not face it alone." When Miss Marple left the cottage, the sky had darkened further, and a fine drizzle began to fall soft, steady, cleansing. She walked slowly toward the village green, where Constable Wilkins and the vicar stood waiting anxiously, their faces lined with worry. "Miss Marple," the constable said breathlessly, "you've been with her a long while. Is everything all right?" Miss Marple paused beneath the old chestnut tree, the rain lightly tapping her hat. She looked at both men with gentle gravity. "The time has come," she said softly, "for the truth to be spoken aloud." The vicar's lips parted in sorrow. "You know, then?" Miss Marple nodded. "I know enough to say this. Thomas Ravenscroft did not take his own life, but neither was he murdered in cold blood." The constable blinked. I don't understand." Miss Marple looked toward the Ravenscroft cottage, where the widow sat alone with her guilt. "It was an accident," she said, "born of fear, followed by a terrible attempt to hide the truth." She set her cane firmly on the ground. "And it is time, Constable, that confession meets compassion. This village must learn what happened, not to condemn, but to heal." She turned toward the church, its belfry standing silent and tall. "The breaking point has come," she murmured. "And now we must gather the pieces." Chapter 8. Truth in the Belfry. The bells of St. Mellow's chimed softly at dusk, their notes drifting across the village like a gentle summons. People emerged one by one from their cottages, drawn, not by command, but by the quiet, unmistakable understanding that something long held in shadow was about to come to light. Miss Marple stood near the low stone wall bordering the churchyard, her posture calm and dignified. The sky behind her had taken on the pale violet hue of late evening. Mist curled around the gravestones, lending a somber grace to the moment. Constable Wilkins approached her nervously. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "I'm not sure how the villagers will take this." Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear Wilkins, truth is like sunrise. It may dazzle the eyes at first, but soon one sees more clearly. The vicar stood nearby, hands clasped, face heavy with worry. Mrs. Pembroke, Mrs. Aldridge, Mr. Dinright, and several others formed a small semicircle around the belfry steps. When the Ravenscroft cottage door opened, every head turned. Mrs. Ravenscroft stepped into the fading light, pale, trembling, wrapped in her shawl like someone bracing herself against the world. Her eyes glistened with the weight of the confession she had not yet spoken aloud. Miss Marple walked toward her and offered her a steadying arm. "You are not alone," she whispered. Together they stepped toward the waiting village. Miss Marple raised her voice only enough to be heard over the soft rustling of the wind. "My friends," she began, "thank you for gathering. You all loved Thomas Ravenscroft, a good man, an honest man." Heads nodded across the crowd, some grieving, some confused, some worried. Miss Marple continued. "In recent days many have whispered in fear, asking how a man of such character could take his own life. And you were right to question it. A hush settled around them. It was not a suicide." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Pembroke pressed a hand to her chest. Mr. Dinright muttered, "I knew it." Constable Wilkins cleared his throat, trying to maintain order. Miss Marple lifted her chin. "Let us speak plainly. The clues were here, in this very churchyard. Asterisk frost, disturbed in places where no footsteps should be. Asterisk drag marks inconsistent with a man walking of his own will. Asterisk a rope too dry for the cold night. Asterisk a suicide note written in a trembling hand that was not Thomas's." She stepped closer to the belfry. "And a lilac petal white, fresh and out of season." She paused, letting the significance settle over them. All these pointed not to despair, but to staging. The vicar closed his eyes. "And so," Miss Marple said softly, "I looked not only for a culprit, but for a story. A human story. Fear, guilt, love, and panic often leave deeper marks than malice ever does." Her eyes turned to Mrs. Ravenscroft, whose breath hitched. Miss Marple took Mrs. Ravenscroft's hand gently, supportively. "Thomas Ravenscroft discovered an error in the church accounts," she explained. "Money had been moved, and someone feared the consequences." Whispers surged through the villagers. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "He confronted the person responsible, not with anger, but with disappointment." Mrs. Ravenscroft's eyes filled with tears. "In that moment," Miss Marple continued, "fear overcame judgment. A struggle ensued. Not violence, only a desperate attempt to stop him from leaving." Mrs. Ravenscroft let out a small, strangled cry. "The push was small," Miss Marple whispered. "A gesture of fear, not hatred." She looked at the villagers with gentle sorrow. "He fell. He struck his head. A tragic accident." The crowd froze shocked, silent, breathless. No one meant for harm, but fear of shame, fear of losing him, fear of the village's judgment clouded all reason. And in that fear an attempt was made to disguise the truth. Miss Marple held Mrs. Ravenscroft's trembling hand more firmly. "She dragged him here," she said softly, "thinking that a false suicide would spare her condemnation. But secrets, my friends, do not stay buried." Mrs. Ravenscroft sank to her knees, sobbing. "I didn't mean to," she cried. "I loved him. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do." The villagers stared not in anger, but in stunned sadness. Miss Marple knelt beside her, steady and calm as ever. "My dear, you have carried this alone long enough." For several long moments no one spoke. The air hung heavy with shock, grief, and the rawness of a human frailty laid bare. At last Mrs. Aldridge stepped forward, her expression soft. "Poor child," she whispered. "You should have come to us." Mr. Dinright shook his head slowly. It was panic, nothing more. Mrs. Pembroke dabbed at her eyes. "Oh, heavens! To think of what she's endured." The constable cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, what should be done now?" Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. "The law must be informed," she said gently but firmly, "for truth must meet its proper course." Mrs. Ravenscroft bowed her head in resignation. "But," Miss Marple added, raising her voice slightly, "the law also recognizes intent. And intent matters. This was no murder. It was a tragic accident, followed by a desperate mistake." She glanced at the vicar. "And our village," she said softly, "must also decide whether compassion has a place beside justice." The vicar stepped forward, placing his hand on Mrs. Ravenscroft's shoulder. "My dear child," he said quietly, "you will not face this alone." Mrs. Ravenscroft sobbed harder, overwhelmed. One by one, villagers approached her, some touching her shoulder, some nodding in comfort, some offering quiet words of forgiveness. Fear slowly dissolved into grief. Grief slowly into empathy. St. Mellow's was a village of soft hearts beneath sometimes stern exteriors, and once truth was spoken, kindness blossomed. As the villagers dispersed, some still tearful, some thoughtful, some shaken, Miss Marple remained near the belfry, looking out over the quiet churchyard. Constable Wilkins approached her shyly. You handled that beautifully, Miss Marple," he said. "I don't know how you remain so calm." Miss Marple gave a small, warm smile. "My dear Wilkins, goodness survives in villages not because people are perfect, but because they are willing to forgive." He nodded slowly. "And what of Mrs. Ravenscroft?" "She must face what must be faced," Miss Marple said softly. "But she will face it with truth behind her, not fear. And that makes all the difference." Wilkins exhaled deeply. "You're remarkable, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled, looking up at the darkening sky where the first star trembled faintly. "No, my dear. I simply listen to people, to places, to the quiet things others overlook." She began walking down the path toward the village. "The mystery is solved," she murmured to herself, "but understanding, that is the true work." Her silhouette moved gently into the fading evening, light, calm, wise, and steady as ever. For in St. Mellow's, peace had begun to return, carried on the wings of truth, spoken softly, and compassion shared freely. Chapter 9. The Aftermath of Truth. The morning after Miss Marple's quiet revelation dawned pale and subdued. A soft drizzle misted over St. Mellow's, settling into rooftops, hedges, and cobbled lanes like the village itself were exhaling after holding its breath for days. Miss Marple stood at her window in the guest-house, watching villagers move slowly about their morning tasks. No hurried steps today. No tight clusters whispering in corners. Instead, a kind of solemn calm had draped itself over the streets. Mrs. Pembroke knocked lightly and entered with a tray of tea. "It feels different today," she whispered, "like a heaviness has lifted even though hearts are still sore." Miss Marple nodded gently, inhaling the delicate steam from her teacup. "Truth always clears the air," she said softly. "Sometimes painfully, sometimes mercifully, but clearing it does." Mrs. Pembroke sat opposite her, her eyes warm with concern. "What will happen to Mrs. Ravenscroft?" "Constable Wilkins is with her now," Miss Marple replied. "He will send for the inspector from Melchester, as is proper. But he also understands this was a tragedy, not a crime of malice." Mrs. Pembroke sighed. "Poor creature! Imagine living with that moment forever." Miss Marple laid her hand gently atop hers. "Grief shared is lighter than grief carried alone. The village is already reaching for her. That is something." Outside, a child's laughter drifted across the lane, soft hesitant but real. St. Mellow's was beginning to breathe again. Constable Wilkins stood at the Ravenscroft cottage door, cap in hand, boots damp from the morning rain. He hesitated before knocking, though he had stood at many doors in his years of small village constabulary. This one felt heavier. Mrs. Ravenscroft opened the door slowly. She seemed smaller today, eyes swollen, hair undone, shawl clutched like an anchor. "Constable," she whispered, stepping aside. Wilkins removed his cap respectfully. "I won't take much of your time, ma'am. I'm very sorry for what you've gone through." She nodded, swallowing. "I understand." He sat awkwardly at the edge of a chair. "The inspector will come by this afternoon," he said quietly. "There will be questions. But Miss Marple has spoken on your behalf, and so will the vicar." They both believed strongly this was an accident. Tears pooled in Mrs. Ravenscroft's eyes. "I wish I could undo it," she whispered. "Every moment of it." Wilkins lowered his gaze, his voice softening. "We all do things in fear that we never would in calm. That doesn't make you wicked." She looked at him with deep gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured. He stood to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Ravenscroft, if ever you need anything at all, the village isn't against you. Truly." Her chin trembled as she nodded. When the door closed, Wilkins exhaled shakily. He had expected anger or resentment toward her, but after hearing Miss Marple's explanation, all he felt was sorrow, and an odd sense of peace that the truth, though painful, was finally known. As the morning wore on, villagers gathered in small, subdued groups. Outside the bakery, near the old well by the post office, their murmurs lacked the edge of suspicion now. Instead, their tones held compassion and a quiet reckoning. Mrs. Aldridge wiped down her shop counter, shaking her head. "If only she'd said something," she murmured to Mrs. Pembroke. "We'd have helped. We always help our own." "We shall help now," Mrs. Pembroke replied firmly. "No one should grieve alone." Mr. Dinright, leaning on his garden wall, spoke to the vicar with troubled gentleness. "I'd always thought Thomas the strong sort," he said, "and he was. But perhaps strength isn't only in men, it's in a village, too, in how we forgive." The vicar nodded solemnly. "And in how we support those who falter." Up the lane, two children whispered to each other. "Is Mrs. Ravenscroft bad?" "No," the older one said softly. "She's sad, and villagers must be kind to sad people." Miss Marple observed all this from her slow walk through town, her gaze kind, her understanding deep. She had seen many communities torn apart by secrecy. St. Mellow's, despite its shock, was holding itself with remarkable grace. It warmed her heart in a way few things did. In the quiet of afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the belfry. The rain had stopped, leaving the stones glistening faintly under the pale sunlight. She touched the cold railing gently, as though acknowledging the place where truth had hidden and where truth had been uncovered. She knelt briefly at the base of the steps, examining the ground one last time. The frost was gone. The drag marks had softened into the earth. Nature was slowly erasing the signs of tragedy, as if the village deserved to heal. Footsteps approached behind her. The vicar stood with hands folded, looking exhausted but relieved. "I came to thank you," he said quietly, "for sparing us the bitterness that could have grown from misunderstanding." Miss Marple smiled tenderly. "My dear Reverend, people are often more forgiving than we expect. They simply need the truth presented gently, like a fragile teacup handed across a table." The vicar laughed softly. "Your wisdom humbles me, Miss Marple." She shook her head modestly. "Not wisdom, simply long acquaintance with human nature. It is rarely cruel by intent, only by fear." They both glanced toward the Ravenscroft cottage, where the curtains fluttered slightly. "The inspector will come," the vicar said. "There will be process." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but process need not prevent compassion." She looked toward the belfry, again its silhouette sharp against the clearing sky. "Pain brought us here, but truth will help us leave." By evening, St. Mellow's felt softer, gentler, as though the village had begun knitting itself back together. Children played quietly in the lane. The bakery reopened for the late-hour customers. Lamps flickered warm light through cottage windows. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Pembroke by the hearth, sipping tea as the fire crackled. "You've given us back our peace," Mrs. Pembroke said softly. Miss Marple gave a gentle chuckle. "Oh, my dear, peace was always here. It was only hiding behind shadows." Mrs. Pembroke nodded thoughtfully. "And Mrs. Ravenscroft? She will face consequences," Miss Marple said, "but not hatred, and certainly not abandonment." They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Mrs. Pembroke sighed. "You've a way of making even the hardest truths feel bearable." Miss Marple smiled with warm humility. "Truth is never the enemy," she said softly. "It is the fear of truth that does the greatest harm." Outside the window, the village bell tolled softly, as though marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Miss Marple glanced toward the sound and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow will bring clarity, and then healing." Her silhouette, bathed in the soft glow of the fire, felt like the quiet heart of St. Mellow's, itself steady, wise, and ever watchful. Chapter 10. Healing in St. Mellow's. The inspector from Melchester arrived just after sunrise, his boots crisp against the damp cobblestones. Inspector Harrington was a tall, stern man with salt-and-pepper hair and a measured stride that suggested decades of methodical police work. Constable Wilkins met him with a stiff posture and nervous palms. "Thank you for coming, sir," Wilkins said, voice trembling slightly. I must warn you, it isn't a typical case." Inspector Harrington glanced around the quiet village. "So I've been told. Where is Miss Marple?" Wilkins pointed up the lane. "She's with the vicar. They're expecting you." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "I've heard of Miss Marple," he said with a faint smile. "Sharp mind. Sees more in a shoelace than most men do in a confession." They walked together toward the churchyard, where Miss Marple waited beneath the old chestnut tree. She greeted the inspector with calm warmth, as though welcoming a distant nephew. "Good morning, Inspector," she said gently. "You have come for clarity, I believe." "I hope so," he replied respectfully. "Constable Wilkins tells me you've uncovered quite the tangle." Miss Marple nodded. "Not a tangle, Inspector. Merely a truth hidden under a blanket of fear." She led him toward the Ravenscroft cottage. "It is best," she said softly, "that you hear the widow's own words, and then I shall explain what I observed." The inspector followed, listening carefully. Something in his eyes, an old sorrow, perhaps softened as she spoke. He had seen tragedy before, but rarely tragedy so steeped in love and terror. Mrs. Ravenscroft sat at the table, hands clasped tightly together, shawl wrapped around her shoulders like a thin armor. She looked up when the inspector entered, eyes swollen from sleeplessness, but courage flickering faintly in them. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," Inspector Harrington said gently, taking a seat across from her, "I need to hear your account from your own lips. There is no judgment in my tone, only duty." She nodded shakily. I will tell it." Her voice trembled at first, but as she continued, she found the strength to speak the truth that had weighed heavily on her soul. She described the argument with Thomas, the discovery of the misused funds, the disappointment in his eyes, the terror that seized her when he threatened to go to the vicar. "I tried to stop him," she whispered, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Just a moment's desperation. I never meant to hurt him. Never." Inspector Harrington listened without interruption, his expression deeply serious, yet not unkind. When she described dragging Thomas's body to the belfry in her panic, Wilkins looked away, struggling with his own grief. "And the note?" Harrington asked softly. Mrs. Ravenscroft nodded miserably. "I forged it. I thought it would protect me, but it only made everything worse." She lowered her head. "I accept whatever punishment you deem fit." Silence rested over the room for a long moment. Inspector Harrington finally spoke. "Mrs. Ravenscroft," he said quietly, "you committed no murder. What happened was a tragic accident, a consequence of fear and poor judgment. But you attempted to conceal it, which complicates matters." Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "Inspector," she said softly, "may I speak?" He nodded. "Her concealment was born of panic, not malice. She has already punished herself more severely than any court could." Mrs. Ravenscroft sobbed softly into her hands. Harrington sighed deeply. "The law must have its say," he murmured. "But I see no threat in her, no ill intent." He closed his notebook gently. "The decision, then, will honor both truth and compassion." By midday, word had drifted quietly through St. Mellow's that the inspector had reached his conclusions. Villagers gathered not out of curiosity, but out of concern. Mrs. Aldridge arrived carrying warm bread. Mr. Denwright brought chopped firewood to the Ravenscroft porch. Mrs. Pembroke insisted on preparing meals for the next few days. No one whispered any more. No one pointed fingers. No one spoke of blame. Instead, one by one, they approached Mrs. Ravenscroft with gentle kindness. "You're not alone," Mrs. Pembroke whispered, embracing her. "We'll look after you," Mr. Denwright said gruffly. "We all stumble," Mrs. Aldridge murmured. "It's how we rise that matters." The widow cried anew, not in fear, but in relief. Inspector Harrington observed quietly. "A remarkable village," he said softly. Miss Marple nodded. "Goodness persists," she said, "even when shadows fall." The vicar stepped forward and prayed with the gathered villagers, his voice soft but resolute. "May Thomas rest in peace, and may those who loved him find comfort." The rain had stopped, and sunlight broke gently through the clouds, casting a thin, golden glow across the churchyard. St. Mellow's was healing. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple and Inspector Harrington stood together near the low stone wall overlooking the fields. "You have a gift, Miss Marple," the inspector said quietly. "You find truth not to condemn, but to heal." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, Inspector, I merely observe. It is people who heal themselves once they dare to face what is real." He nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you've saved this village from a bitterness that could have lasted years." She tapped her cane lightly against the stones. "I've lived long enough to know," she said softly, "that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Helping people see clearly is kindness in its own way." The inspector studied her with renewed respect. "If ever you tire of village life, Miss Marple," he said with a light smile, "the constabulary could use a mind like yours." "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple chuckled, "I prefer my roses and knitting well. Not knitting any more, apparently, but still." They both laughed softly. The moment was light but warm. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Miss Marple prepared to leave St. Mellow's. Mrs. Pembroke helped her with her bag while the vicar and Constable Wilkins waited by the carriage. Mrs. Ravenscroft approached slowly, pale, fragile, but calmer. "Miss Marple," she whispered, voice trembling, "thank you. You saved me from drowning in my own guilt." Miss Marple took her hands gently. "No, my dear, you saved yourself by telling the truth. That is courage." Tears filled the widow's eyes. "I will never forget you," Miss Marple smiled warmly. "And I shall not forget St. Mellow's." She stepped into the carriage and settled her things neatly. Constable Wilkins tipped his cap. "Safe travels, Miss Marple, and thank you for everything." The carriage began to move. Miss Marple looked out at the village one last time, the belfry rising serenely above the rooftops, children skipping along the lane, villagers tending their homes with new softness. "Truth," she whispered to herself, "always comes home." And as the road curved away, St. Mellow's faded gently behind her, peace restored, hearts mending, the quiet village forever shaped by a tragedy faced with honesty and care. Miss Marple closed her eyes, the rhythm of the carriage soothing. Another mystery resolved, another village healed, another reminder that even the smallest truths can carry the greatest weight. She smiled softly, and the journey continued.